Hello, and welcome to another edition of All or None According to Jack with your host, Jack Toledano. As you may have heard that little snippet, tonight we are going to talk about the Rolling Stones. And this episode is actually going to be the next edition of Reviewing the Reviewer. Not so much a review, but this is more of a full-length feature film that I found on Tubi uh, called Rolling Stone, The Life and Death of Brian Jones. So yeah, so this episode is basically going to be about Brian Jones of the Rolling Stones. So just to give you a little background, and in order to do that, I'm going to need to share and go to the PowerPoint. Let's go to the PowerPoint if I can find it. Share. There you go. So Brian Jones. Let's talk about Brian Jones. Brian Jones was a very eclectic member of the Rolling Stones. He founded the Stones in the, I'm not going to basically go through the entire story, but word has it that he founded the Stones, recruited everybody, put them together, was the early manager until Andrew Loog Oldham came in and kind of changed everything. But some nice early pictures of Mr. Jones with his Vox teardrop-shaped guitar. Early on, looking like the rock star that he was early on. So basically, my story is that my parents were not big record collectors. So yeah, no, the people that do that show, The Curse of the Collector, they would not like to hear that. They did not have a lot of records, but they did have some 45s, a bunch of Elvis 45s, and then for the late 60s, early 70s, my parents, or my father in particular, had this thing about collecting Italian music, on record, whether it be pop or rock or even Italian prog rock, believe it or not, unbeknownst to them. But in their collection, they had this. And you know what? I would play some of their records, and I was only 4 or 5 years old, and we were living in an apartment in Flushing, Queens, New York, and they had this console with a record player and whatnot. And my phone's annoying the crap out of me. There we go. So in their collection, I don't know what possessed my father to wasn't a big Rolling Stones fan or a Beatles fan, but they had this in their collection. And you know what? I played this and I loved it. I mean, as a 4 or 5 year old kid hearing Satisfaction, The Last Time, 19th Nervous Breakdown, It's All Over Now, Time Is on My Side, those those songs really kicked ass, and you know what? They made a fan of me for life. And looking at this cover, uh, not really knowing names, not really knowing who's who, or what instrument they play, or who writes any songs. There's there's Brian Jones right in the front there. And as a 4 or 5 year old kid, I see this. What does it make you think? It makes you think he's the leader of the band. And for a while he was. And unfortunately, we'll get into it. Uh, but what he wasn't a very well liked person. We'll get into that. He did have some problems. They didn't have a word for it today, but uh, they didn't have a word for it back then. But who knows? Maybe today they would have diagnosed him as being bipolar. You know, up one minute, down the next. And, with his drug problems, he alienated a lot of people. Mick Jagger and Keith Richards, who I didn't even know it at the time, were becoming the real leaders of the band. They were able to write songs, and basically, there's this thing called song power, where they were able to wrest away control of the band slowly but surely, with help of Andrew Lou Oldham, because he was a bright manager in those early days. He would tell him, "Look, this is what you have to do to be successful. Like the Beatles, you have to write songs." Uh, you know, Brian, we know, had many children out of wedlock. They basically buried it for him. Paid off a few women to just go back under that stone and stay quiet. And yeah, so, but as a 4 or 5 year old child, I didn't know that at the time. I thought he was the leader of the band. I thought he played the guitars and sang the songs. I didn't realize that the singer was Mick Jagger. Didn't realize that until into the 70s. Uh, I didn't really get to know them until, believe it or not, they put out Miss You in, was it 1976, 77? And little did I know that Keith Richards was actually the brains behind most of the music. But we'll get into that too. Of course, Bill Wyman is hidden there, and then Charlie Watts, great drummer in the background. Um, so, but not only this album led me to believe that he was the leader of the Stones, some of their other early albums. So you got Out of Their Heads, there he is in the front again. He's in a prominent spot here, uh, basically as equal billing with Keith Richards, and there's Mick Jagger in the background. Andrew Lou Goldham was going to change that pretty soon. He wanted Jagger, and mainly Jagger, to be the front man of the band. So, next slide, please. These are just some other examples of Brian being in a very prominent role. I particularly like this one. This one, uh, love that. What's that? A smoker's jacket? Yeah, playing my favorite sport. Uh, this is early on before they decided to stop using their you know uniformity, or so to speak. Love this picture with the white hat, and then this one as well. Another prominent spot right in the front and center. Yep, Brian Jones. So we'll come back to to the PowerPoint a little bit later. But for now, let's stop sharing and let's talk about the movie. So it was about an hour 40 minutes. Uh, Again, I was thumbing through all the movies that they had. The rock and roll. Should you say documentaries, or hour-long shows talking about a certain album. In this case, it's more talking about a band member, uh, and I will get into the uh, the movie and rate it at the end. But just to kind of give you some snippets, as it will. So people that were in it that spoke about Brian Jones. So you had Simon Wells, author of Butterfly on a Wheel; Chris Salowitz, author of Dear God, the 27 Club, which Brian was an early member of; Keith Eltham, a PR guru; Sam Cutler, Rolling Stones tour manager in 1969. I'm sure he had some say in the matter, with the fact that Brian couldn't tour come 69. Stephen Woolley, director of the movie Stoned. I did see that as well. I didn't think very highly of it, but you know what? I will have a, excuse me, folks. I will have a follow-up to this, maybe a second or episode, and we will talk about some of the other documentaries of Brian Jones and the early Rolling Stones that I saw. Phil May, The Pretty Things, Jared Mankiewicz, a photographer, uh, Ian Stewart, voice only, but he was uh, he was a Rolling Stones keyboardist, somebody I really felt sorry for. He didn't have that rock and roll look, so to speak, that according to Andrew Oldham, so he got relegated to the back. He wasn't an official member of the Stones. Instead, he played in the studio and he was a road manager. And he played sometimes backstage, sometimes on the side of the stage, and the rest was history. Graham Ride, friend and author of Foundation Stone. Richard Hatchell, a friend. Alexis Corner, father of British blues voice only. Dick Taylor, early member of the Rolling Stones and the Pretty Things. He left, I think, on his own accord. Cleo Silvestri, singer actress. Terry O'Neill, photographer. There may be more, but those are the people that mainly spoke on camera. So I'm breaking up. So it was about, I would say, hour and 40 minutes. So breaking it up into quadrants of about three, four, five, six little sections of the actual movie. So beginning, uh, they do an aerial scene of Hodgefield Farms, Brian's home till he passed away. Uh, this tell and basically what they do is they tell the back of the story first of when he dies. Uh, he bought the house from the person who was the author of Winnie the Pooh before it got bought out by Disney. Don't know his name. Then they talk about Tom Keelock, driver of the Stones, and possible key to the mystery of Brian's death. Uh, they mentioned that they were already rehearsing with Mick Taylor. This was early in the film. Uh, they talk about June 8th, 1969, only 3 days after my 5th birthday. Brian is let go by Mick, Keith, and Charles. Sad. There's a lot of great photos in this documentary. Brian created his. Somebody stated, one of the people who spoke stated that basically Brian created his own demise. Uh, Ian Stewart said that he was basically set on destroying himself. So, yeah, that's 0 to 10 minutes. Then the 10:34 to 21 minute mark, they talk about his early history, his childhood. That he played the sax, he played the clarinet, he played the piano. Parents were disappointed with his musical choices. Hello, whose parent isn't? I don't think my my parents were doing cartwheels when I started to become a Kiss fan. Brian's many children. He had 3 children by the age of 19. We talk about his jazz and blues influences. He's about that time is when he started to play the guitar, and he learned to play the slide guitar on his own. Uh, One of the documentaries that I saw was that he went to like a gas station and to look for like a little metal tube that he could slide on his ring finger so that he could start, or in pinky, I don't know which one it was, one of those fingers so that he could start to teach himself how to play the slide guitar. And supposedly he was one of the first guitarists in Great Britain to to master the slide guitar. Uh, they talk about Edith Grove, where Brian, Mick, and Keith first lived. Uh, they called it a hellhole on earth. Brian arranged the early gigs, named the band. Dick Taylor said that he was an amazing slide player, but then he left. Uh, there was an early bone of contention of who ran the band. They also didn't like the fact that uh, Brian basically took an extra 5 pounds uh, per gig, him for himself. That didn't sit well with the band. Uh, so I was out at a dinner party and I was talking about the subject to somebody who said that he read a book. Keith Richards wrote a book, basically said that he was a good musician, but not a great musician. So, and of course, he also stated that his inability to write songs. So that's where we are. Third quadrant, the 21 and a half minute mark. Andrew Luke Oldham mentioned, became their manager, relegated Ian Stewart to session musician. Bastard. Uh, Brian, the leader, making 5 pounds more to the chagrin of the others. They talk about Andrew Mick. Uh, right. Speaking of Andrew, saying that made a joke about Mick doing this when he was in his 40s. Of course, back then, who knew that the bands would last this long? Who who knew they'd last into the 70s? Most bands didn't. Hello, the Beatles, among others. Uh, Tensions in the band early on. Brian not liking the direct, liking the songs or the direct, basically the songs that were written by the what the hell is it, the Stones, Jagger and Richards in particular, or the direction. He liked to play the blues. Andrew Lou Goldham said, "Look, you play the blues, you play covers, you're not going to last very long. You got to do like Lennon and McCartney, start your own little branding or you know songwriting partnership, and that might sustain you a little longer." What else? They also talk about Brian not being able to write, sadly. We'll get into that more. Uh, Satisfaction changed the dynamics of the leadership. Uh, Once Jagger and Richard had a couple hits under their belts, there was really no turning back. Uh, Basically, I read that Andrew Oldham tried to set up a partnership between Brian and a songwriter named Gene Pitney, who was also a singer in the 60s, but supposedly after 2 days that didn't pan out. Uh, I'll quote what Mick says later, but basically what they said was these were songs that did not deserve to see the light of day. Uh, you know what? I did hear some of the things that he put together. Um, I'll talk about he did do do the soundtrack of a movie that Anita Pallenberg, his girlfriend at the time, was in, one of those avant-garde movies. But you know what? Basically, soundtrack or background music. Uh, it's not a great song written like, say, "Sympathy for the Devil" or "You Can't Always Get What You Want," or the great early songs that I mentioned. "The Last Time." Um, what's another one? Uh, "Get Off My Cloud," songs that I freaking love. "Honky Tonk Women." I don't think he had that ability, and that partially was his undoing. Uh, Great musician, would contribute greatly to a song, but couldn't write. Possibly bipolar, started with drug addiction. 5 different children with 5 different women. Uh, At about the 35 to 39 minute mark, Anita comes into the picture, Anita Pallenberg. So, yeah, we're back. Had to take a quick break there. But basically, so we were at the 39-minute mark of the film. So I'm just going to just hold, pause there for a second and talk about the songwriting. So this is what Mick Jagger had to say. So where is it? Uh, can't find it. Oh, there it is. So Jagger told Rolling Stone that Jones was jealous of the Jagger Richards songwriting team, and added, "To be honest, Brian had no talent for writing songs, none. I've never known a guy with less talent for songwriting." Uh, so, so what he did in 1966, um, and that's where the film leaves off. So we're getting back into talking about the film. Brian does do a sound. He asks to do the soundtrack of the movie that Anita is going to be in 1966, an avant-garde thriller or whatever called A Degree of Murder. Uh, by this time, he's in rough shape. Nicky Hopkins, Keith, and Jimmy Page supposedly came in to help him actually do the work, to create the soundtrack. But he did receive writer's credit for that. That's like one of the only things he got writer's credit for. Going back to the songwriting, he did get credit in the early period. They had this pseudonym called Nanker Felge. So what is Nanker Felge? Basically what it is, it's a pseudonym for all 5 members of the early Rolling Stones at that time. Brian, Mick, Keith, Charlie, and Bill, and Andrew Lou Goldham. About 12 to 14 songs that they put together, and they gave band credit and they shared the publishing royalties for that. But you know what? Even those songs, they just didn't hold a candle to the Jagger Richards tunes. So my guess is that's why those songs ceased in around, I don't know, 65. Once they got to the Aftermath album, which was I think that was in 65, basically it was pretty much all of their covers were done, and they were now doing pretty much all Jagger Richards originals. Yeah. So, uh, you know, comparing Brian to George Harrison, for example, you know, in the early going, George was kind of in the same boat with the Beatles. They, but the Beatles were a different dynamic because everybody in the band would sing lead vocals even on occasion. And in the early going, Lennon and McCartney actually wrote a couple songs for George to sing. But then George wanted to write, so he just hammered away, and uh, finally he came up with a song that was good enough to put on an album, "Don't Bother Me," a song that I like. Uh, and then slowly but surely, George was able to contribute. Got to the point where he contributed, 1 or 2 songs on Rubber Soul, a great album. 3 songs on Revolver, including uh, a song that really gave him notice, Taxman, a song that was so good they put it as the leadoff track. Uh, 4 songs on the White Album, 2 big hit songs on what the hell's the Abbey Road, Come Together, not Come Together, Something, and Here Comes the Sun. So, you know what? I think part of it was the drugs. I don't think Brian tried hard enough. Who knows? He was a talented musician. Maybe he could have put something together like George did. I mean, look at how George's career took off after the Beatles split up. He had a great solo career. All right. Anyway, enough banter on that. So let's go back to the film. So the 39-minute mark forward. Um, so yeah, sessions for Satanic Majesty's request. Again, they went psychedelic. I'm sure Brian wasn't happy about that. He didn't even play guitar on that album. He played, a lot of different instruments, organ, dulcimer. Uh, what else did he play? Let's see. Let's go to that album. Do, 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 do. We're going to go to that album. Discography. Your Satanic Majesty's Request. What did he play on that album? He played a lot of mellotron, an instrument that I love, some saxophone, vibraphone, Jew's harp, flute, organ, electric dulcimer, recorder, backing vocals on the first song, sing this all together, and what else? Harp. He plays the harp on the last song, On With the Show. So, yeah. It was rumored that he would just show up to the studio with a new instrument every time, and they would try to accommodate him. But if you're bringing in a dulcimer or a mellotron when they're trying to play a blues song, it doesn't fit. Yeah. So anyway, so Sergeant Pilcher going after musicians in London for drugs, trying to, they were trying to bust these musicians for, for doing drugs and saying that they're doing drugs, and it being known. So Brian, Mick, and Keith all got busted. So they went away to Morocco for a little while. Brian ended up in the hospital. Gets physical with Anita. Anita and Keith split from Morocco, leaving Brian behind. Brian tried to reconcile with Anita, but that was like probably the end of his friendship with Keith. So that's the next section, the 48-minute mark. Lewis Jones speaks. That's Brian's father. Speaks about that being the turning point of Brian's life. His unhappiness about losing Anita, getting busted, basically feeling isolated, marginalized by the band. They say that he was no longer useful to the group. That he basically received 9 months, but they got a suspended sentence. Brian got probation. So what are the next albums that they did? That let's go back. So Beggar's Banquet. So I actually saw footage of them recording Sympathy for the Devil, and you could see in that recording they put him in a booth, and who knows if, and in one of the early sessions for recording sessions or rehearsal sections for Sympathy for the Devil, as they were trying to work out the song, he is playing acoustic, but I don't think he played that toward the end of the song. We'll discuss that again later, but many things that I read, he was put in a booth. He was who know they let him think he was contributing, but who knows if they were recording him or put had his mic on or what have you. So what do we have next? At one point, Brian, they would, he'd show up to the studio, and they would, the producers would go up to Mick and Keith and say, what should we have him do? Tell him to fuck off and go home. So then he was busted a second time. headed to Morocco without the Rolling Stones. Uh, he went there to record Brian Jones Presents the Pipes of Pan at Jujuka. I mean, they said he was a producer, but what did he do? He showed up with this four-track recorder that was maybe, what, that big? Ah, boy. So now he's getting into world music, getting away from the Stones toward the end of 68. His finances weren't good. Um, so towards the end of 68, they had what they called the Rolling Stones Rock and Roll Circus. And I did watch those recordings, and I gotta tell you, he was a shadow of his former self. His face looked bloated. He was off to the side of the stage. He was no longer that prominent frontal figure, and was clearly Mick Jagger by this time. Now, Mick particularly didn't like the recording, which they shelved till 1996, and I don't know why. I thought it was fantastic. I mean, granted, Brian didn't really contribute anything. I mean, he played guitar for Jumping Jack Flash. He played guitar for a couple other songs, but Sympathy for the Devil, he's playing the maracas. That's it. I don't even think they were mic'd, so I don't think he contributed anything. It's just on stage, slowly. You have to see it for yourself. It's just sad. I mean, others commented that they thought that it was the end of the line for him. Members of The Who, particularly Pete Townsend, Jethro Tull, Ian Anderson, they thought it was basically he had come to the end of the line with the Stones, that he was probably gonna, he was either gonna die or he was gonna get kicked out of the band. Who knew what was gonna happen? Uh, the, the 105 mark till the end, the last 35, 40 minutes. I mean, I'd say the first hour of the movie was informative. They didn't talk as much about the songwriting as I would have liked, but there was a lot of details, a lot of pictures, a lot of footage in the beginning. But after about the 105 mark, all they did was talk about Brian's death, and granted, you got to talk about it somewhat, but they they spent the last hour basically talking about conspiracy theories and what happened. It's all well and good. We should get to the bottom of what happened. And supposedly Frank Thorogood, his builder who was living with him. And if you saw the movie Stoned, it tells another side to this, that basically it suggests that Brian brought this onto himself, and that he infuriated this guy so much that he drowned him. But and supposedly there's rumor that he made a deathbed confession that he basically killed Brian. But there was also suggestion in this film that it was the establishment that covered it up because they wanted to paint a picture that these rock stars are all going to die because they take drugs, that they're no good for you, that this is what happens if you take drugs. You're going to die. You're going to die in a car accident. You're going to drown in your swimming pool, etc., etc. So I'd give it probably 3 out of 4 stars. I mean, there was not too much musical footage. You want good musical footage? See the Rolling Stones Rock and Roll Circus, which I'm thinking of actually getting that DVD set just as a keepsake. A little souvenir for doing this episode. But so the aftermath. So marginalized toward the end, particularly Beggar's Banquet and Let It Bleed, which he didn't even show up anymore after. He barely showed up. He did 2 songs on Let It Bleed. He wasn't going to go to the Beggar's Banquet, or rather, he wasn't going to go to the Rolling Stones rock and roll circus, but he was persuaded to go. Um, he said he hated the Rolling Stones at that point. He didn't like the music. He was jealous of their musical partnership. Uh, what others have said, we already covered them saying that he should go piss off. Uh, Keith stated that Brian was a hard man to like. Uh, Wyman, Richards, and Watts have commented that he could be cruel and difficult. Bill Wyman further notes, two sides to his personality: introverted, shy, sensitive, deep thinking. The other, a preening peacock, gregarious, artistic, desperately needing assurance. He pushed every friendship to the limit and way beyond. Um, it should be noted that in the early days, he was probably the most popular Stone. In addition to what I saw on the cover, his face prominently, suggested that he is the leader of the band. Uh, Supposedly, a lot of the fan mail was directed towards him, and all the girls liked him, and that you know that kind of chapped Mick Jagger's ass, and I can understand why. Uh, so Mick, uh, this is what Mick had to say, and this is very profound. So Mick asked if he felt guilty about Jones' death. No, I really don't. Uh, I do feel that I behaved in a childish way, but we were very young, and in some ways we picked on him. But unfortunately, he made himself a target for it. He was very jealous, very difficult, very manipulative, and if you do that in this kind of a group of people, you get back as good as you give, to be honest. I wasn't understanding enough about his drug addiction. No one seemed to know much about drug addiction. Things like LSD were all new. No one knew the harm. People thought cocaine was good for you. Ugh, wow. So, even at the tender age of 5 years old, so summer of '69, my parents rented a bungalow up in the Monticello area, and we stayed up there for the summer. And I did day camp, and we were kind of isolated. There was no television. I do know my uncle Mike went up to Woodstock that summer and came to visit us because he was nearby. But knew I never heard anything about Brian Jones dying in July of '69. But still sad, you know. As I got into rock and roll in the late '70s, but we still didn't have this thing called internet. So I mean, I heard of him, I knew who he was, but uh, I see the beginning of this movie on Channel 13 at the time called "Gimme Shelter." And it shows the Altamont Raceway stabbing with the Hells Angels, and they show Mick Taylor as the guitarist. I'm like, what? I didn't know they changed guitarists. So then I slowly started to read things later about how he died of drugs and, died in the swimming pool and whatnot. But so this kind of concludes it. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back. I'm going to share one more time. So a little collage that I put together of Brian, and it builds. And this is how we're going to say goodnight. Is Brian playing his Vox teardrop guitar. Brian playing his sitar, probably possibly during Painted Black or Street Fighting Man. In his flowery look, that could be during the their Majesties their Satanic Majesty's request, that period of time, with the flowery look. Nice little spotlight on him. Again with his fox warming up backstage for a show. There looks like he's playing a Rickenbacker. Yep, there's that hat again. This was, I think, in 65, 66. Brian's starting to get marginalized at that time. There he's playing electric piano or organ, one of those. So there he is in his gangster suit with Bill Wyman next to him. Oh, looks like Bill Wyman's playing a teardrop bass. Didn't know they existed. Last but not least, there he is again. That looks like towards the very end with where they're at the Rolling Stones Rock and Roll Circus. I think that's what he was wearing at that time. So I'll stop sharing and we'll say goodnight. This is Jack Toledano speaking for All or Not According to Jack. If you like what I do, please subscribe. If you have suggestions for other documentaries that I could review, please let me know. Have a good one, folks.